Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. I'm Dick Morningstar. I'm founding chairman of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm with you virtually. I was going to say that I wish I were with you in person, but when you see the palm tree behind me, I was concerned that I would have been lying. But then when I hear that the weather is 70 degrees in Washington and a beautiful day, maybe I do wish I were there with you. But seriously, I'm really looking forward to today's program. And thank you for joining with us this evening or this afternoon and evening, wherever you are, on our event on reinforcing transatlantic energy cooperation and launching our final report on reducing Europe's reliance on Russian energy imports under 5 different scenarios. And I want to specifically thank the Smith Richardson Foundation for their support on this 18-month project that we have been working on. I also want to next welcome our very good friend, Ditte Juul Jørgensen, a good friend and a good friend of the Atlantic Council. Ditte, as most of you know, is the Director General for Energy at the European Commission. And really, her leadership has just been amazing in furthering US-EU cooperation and in leading the EU through the energy crisis brought about by the war in Ukraine. I also want to thank very much the co-authors of our report, my co-authors, Andras Shemony, former Hungarian ambassador to NATO and to the US, and Andras is a senior fellow working with us at the Atlantic Council. Olga Kakova, who's the director of our European Energy Security Program, and Patty Ryan, who also co-authored this report. And I'll make my comments on the report during the panel discussion that will be coming up later. We're going to begin with a fireside chat with Ditte, moderated by Axios reporter Benjamin. He'll then moderate a panel on the report with me, Andras, and Olga. We are going to be on the record. This will be streamed on our website, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you have questions, you can submit them, if I have this correctly, on askac.org. I think that covers all the preliminaries. Looking forward very much to the chat with Ditte. So now I'll turn it over to Ben. Thank you very much, and I'll be back with you later.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and Europe Center for having me here today. And as the Ambassador mentioned, questions, we're going to take some in the room, but they can also come in online through askac.org. And with that, let's get to it. I think this is a very both somber but also fascinating time for this discussion. We're 2 years into this brutal crisis that has truly reshaped and transformed global energy flows and relationships. I think it has also strengthened the U.S.-Europe energy ties, but some big challenges remain. And so I'm very excited to discuss this with Ditte Jørgensen, the Director General for Energy of the European Commission. So let's jump right in. It's been quite a couple of years. How would you describe the energy security situation right now? Is Europe out of its energy crisis, and what were some of the lessons learned?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, first of all, to Ambassador Morningstar, Ambassador Shemony, and thank you very much for inviting me here to join this very timely and interesting conversation. As you said, it's been quite some challenging years, these last 2 years since the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and the Russian weaponization of energy is a very significant part of that war, and a weaponization of energy that was directly related, targeting Europe, our security of supply, our overall security situation. So your question, what is the security of supply situation now, 2 years into that war, 2 years into that weaponization of energy? And I would say it is fairly comfortable in the sense that we are now at the end of the winter 23-24. We're getting very close to The storage filling season, the injection season starts in April, and our storages are very, very comfortable. And when I talk storage, it's gas underground storage. It's not so relevant if you're a gas-producing country, but we're not a gas-producing country in any significant way, and so we need gas underground storage to get us through the winters, essentially. And if you take a step back 2 years, January 2022, just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those same storages, which has an overall capacity of 100 billion cubic meters, at that time that was about 25% of our overall annual consumption, they were half empty. And especially the storage facilities that were operated or owned by Gazprom were technically empty.
Yeah.
So a very, very clear example of how energy was used also at that time in the run-up to the war. And we're now in a completely different situation because of all the measures we have taken. And so I think the first lesson learned has been this required a European solution. All member states agreed. All member states came together. Ministers from the 27 European Union member states came together to find solutions together with us in the European Union, the European Commission. So more Europe is what helped us get through the crisis. More partnership, more transatlantic partnership, more international cooperation, but really most notably the US, our close cooperation there. The US has moved from being one of our LNG suppliers to being by far the biggest supplier of LNG to the European Union. We are your biggest customer in terms of importing LNG from the US. About close to half of your exports go to the European Union. So a very good example of a new transatlantic security partnership. It's not the only one. There's a lot more happening in the energy sector, in particular in relation to clean technology, critical minerals, and the energy transition. But that, I think, is a very, again, concrete example of what we have done together as an US-EU energy security partnership over these last few years. So we are much more secure. We have diversified our supplies. We have invested into the infrastructure that was necessary. We have done demand reduction because that's the button that we can push ourselves. We have control of our demand. And at the same time, we have scaled up and accelerated investments into renewable energy. So in 2023 alone, we added so much renewable energy to the system that was the equivalent of 13 billion cubic meters of gas. So that's about 8-9% of what we imported from Russia before the war. So those 13 billion cubic meters have been replaced by renewable energy. So a combination of US LNG, gas from other suppliers, more renewables and demand reduction, that has filled the gap that we had at the beginning of the war in 2022. At the same time, we have increased our support for Ukraine and strengthened our both the financial support, but also cooperation with Ukraine. As you probably know, at the very beginning of the war, we synchronized Ukraine and Moldova with our electricity system. We are trading with them both electricity and gas, and are cooperating around gas storage, for example. So a lot of that is also happening with Ukraine and Moldova.
You mentioned, I was struck by the fact that you mentioned much of Europe, almost all of Europe, sort of singing in harmony on some level on this fairly rapid transformation. That said, certainly we are going to see some fairly consequential elections in Europe coming up this year. So I'm told there's a big election coming up in the United States as well. What is your sense of how the results could change both that US-Europe relationship and Europe's ability among its own members to sort of confront this ongoing crisis?
Well, I think, first of all, regardless of the elections, the context stays the same. So we are in a very challenging global context. The Russian war in Ukraine rages on 2 years into the war. And there are a number of challenges in terms of the global trade and investment climate as well. So those challenges, whoever wins an election will have to manage those challenges. And if you look at the challenges and if you look at what is it we need to address the challenges in the best possible way, then once again we have seen in Europe that we need to work closely together, the 27 European member states, because we find better solutions in a more efficient, cost-efficient and effective way. And we've also seen that international partnerships are a necessary part of that response, and that the transatlantic partnership really is at the center of that. We have strengthened that already very strong cooperation over the last few years, and I think we're going to need to see more of that as we go forward. Closer cooperation also on the energy transition. Energy transition, again, both for our security, because the crisis for us was partly a crisis of dependence on fossil primarily from Russia, but it was a fossil dependence that has made us less resilient. And we need to overcome that. So the energy transition is necessary for that. The transition is necessary for our competitiveness. And it's necessary, of course, to address the climate crisis. So the energy transition really is part of all of that, and there's room for even stronger transatlantic cooperation, regardless of the outcomes of the elections. In the European Union, we have set ourselves targets for climate neutrality in 2050 under the European Green Deal. We have set ourselves and agreed on legislation. How do we do between now and 2030? So you've got a very stable and predictable framework around that, including a framework for investments in the European Union. We've set ourselves a direction for 2040 as well, and that will not change. That is written into law, and there's agreement on that. How to do it exactly, that's where you hear discussions, and that's an important discussion, of course, to help make sure that we have the democratic debate around that, and that we find the best possible and most cost-efficient ways to do it.
Certainly, the creation of these types of policy frameworks, while it is happening during a crisis, these are obviously fairly long-term planning horizons. In the United States, based on LNG export facilities already approved or under construction, U.S. exports are slated to approximately double for the rest of this decade. That said, given the strong European, right now, needs for U.S. natural gas, I'm wondering, do you agree with some of the concerns that we've heard voiced among European and some Asian industry groups and companies that the U.S. pause on new LNG export licenses is something that could threaten or at least create some uncertainties about this relationship?
As you have said, there is significant export capacity already licensed and scheduled to go online over the coming couple of years. And with that coming online, with those investments going ahead, we really have no concern for our security of supply. We import significant quantities of LNG from the US. We intend to continue to do that. We would like to strengthen the partnership, cooperation, predictability around that. We would like to make sure that the LNG we import is as clean as possible. So we're working very closely together on reducing the methane emissions linked to that import. But that partnership is well established, and that is in no way threatened or questioned by the pause. The pause is a domestic decision, a review, and we'll see what happens after that. But I think it is quite important to underline both that we've had close cooperation and dialogue with the U.S. administration around this, but also that there is no question of security of supply in that context.
Yeah, I know you mentioned it is a domestic decision, but as you also point out, it's something that has repercussions for your relationship as well, and for European supplies, at least in the very much longer term future. So with that said, what would do you plan to provide any future input to the U.S. administration on whether they should approve any more new licenses, or whether, or what the future of this policy should be, given your important role as a customer?
Well, I think indeed, as the most important customer, good to have had the dialogue around the decision, knowing what's coming. Tomorrow here in Washington, we'll have the US-EU Energy Council taking place, and so there will be good discussions at political level on energy security, on the green transition, on the security situation in our neighborhood, and the energy situation for Ukraine and Moldova and other countries, but also on the future areas of cooperation. What does energy security mean now at this point in time, where we also need to make sure we do not have dependencies of critical minerals or other technologies, supply chains that are necessary for our energy system. So tomorrow is also a good opportunity to discuss this issue and many more related to security of supply. And then we hope to continue the close dialogue we have with the US administration, also on these specific aspects beyond the Energy Council, and making sure that the dialogue, the transparency, the open cooperation continues.
Thank you. I wanted to get in a couple more questions, and then I'm hoping we're going to take some from either the audience here or perhaps online. One of the things that's happened very recently over the last few days is we've seen these Ukrainian strikes on some fairly major Russian refineries. Does this signal, in your view, a new phase of this conflict, and what might be some of the repercussions of those attacks?
Well, we of course follow very, very closely the development in the Russian war on Ukraine. Including the impact both on the Ukrainian energy security, the Ukrainian energy system, but also on global energy markets. Because the Russian share in global energy markets has decreased very significantly because of sanctions, because supply of gas to the European Union stopped, we are less concerned about the impact on global markets. We monitor that closely, of course, something of relevance to all of us. But again, the context today is very, very different from where it was in 2022 before Russia invaded Ukraine.
And on clean energy cooperation with the U.S., I mean, one thing that we've been seeing is, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act domestically, obviously we're seeing unprecedented subsidies for domestic factory construction for clean energy facilities, but also other aspects of the infrastructure as well. How does that affect cooperation with Europe? Because on some level, isn't some of this a little bit zero-sum, right? I mean, we've certainly seen some companies almost very publicly say, we are choosing to locate in the United States. Do the U.S. subsidies create any type of tensions with Europe?
Yes, I think the Inflation Reduction Act has created tension, and it's important that we continue a good dialogue and conversation around it. But maybe 3 points on that. First of all, I think I would question the zero-sum nature of this. Mm-hmm. There is a really important opportunity for investment and growth, both for the US and for the European Union in the energy transition and the green technologies. And we see that taking place at both sides of the Atlantic. So I think it's not a zero-sum game. There are wins to be made at both sides of the Atlantic. I think the more closely we cooperate, the better the dialogue, the better the trade and investment cooperation on that, the better results for both of us. So that's the first. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize that the Inflation Reduction Act also has a positive contribution in the sense of investments into green technologies, into low carbon technologies, and thereby helping to make the transition more cost efficient, to develop the technology. So there's an important contribution to addressing the climate crisis and to mitigating the climate crisis following from the Inflation Reduction Act as well. And then the third point is, of course, that a number of the ways in which it's being done, not the how, but really how is it being, not the what, but how is it being done, that will have, or that we see has an impact on investments and the investment choices. So there's not currently a level playing field, and that's where we would like to see steps taken to limit the concerns, to reduce the risks for Europe of that, and again have a closer cooperation around green technology on a transatlantic basis.
Would you like to see specifically? We've seen some and I want to get to the questions in a moment, but we've seen the U.S. begin to reach some sort of fairly mineral-specific trade agreements with some other countries. Is that something that is an active area of discussion? Could we see some either overall US-EU trade agreements that would allow critical minerals or processed minerals from the EU to qualify for the Inflation Reduction Act electric vehicle subsidies, or perhaps on an individual country basis? How active are those discussions?
Indeed, I think cooperation on critical minerals, and specifically critical minerals that are linked to the green transition, is really an important part of a necessary part of the dialogue going forward. We'll address it tomorrow at the US-EU Energy Council as well. That will be part of the discussion. And we have good cooperation in the Minerals Security Partnership, which is a wider forum that we have started and are leading together. So we would like to see that being taken forward. And we would very much like to see, indeed, a further development of the bilateral partnership on critical minerals to improve what's there. Again, it's an area where we have we face similar challenges. Mm-hmm. If you look at where is the global extraction and processing and control, that is a common challenge, and it's a common challenge that we are better at addressing if we work together as much as possible. So a strengthening of the bilateral conversation on that would be very, very welcome.
And just to press a little, perhaps some specific formal agreements like we've seen with some other countries? We'll
wait and see. I think the important thing is what is the result of what we agree? What can we take forward together, and how do we make it as strong an instrument as possible?
Thank you. I would love to throw it to the audience for folks that have questions. I believe there are some microphones that are available to go around. And do we have some hands up over? I thought I saw a hand. Does anyone have a question?
Thank you for taking my question. Max Grünig with E3G. I wanted to ask specifically on the long-term outlook for the gas market in Europe, and therefore also for the transatlantic gas market, because you mentioned that they're respectively the biggest suppliers and customers, and how you see this evolve over time, knowing that, for example, pipeline gas from Norway will in all likelihood remain the last supplier in the sense of the cost offer, at least, or at least that's my understanding. But curious to hear how you see this evolve basically beyond the near term, because we seem to be past the immediate crisis, the absolute urgency. So maybe now we can look further down the road how this might evolve. Thank you.
Yes, I would be glad to address that. So we will continue to need natural gas, fossil gas in our energy system over the coming years and over the coming decades. For us, it's part of the energy transition. So we'll expect to see a continued demand for fossil gas. We have very, very little domestic production, and that domestic production is decreasing fairly rapidly. So it'll be covered from imports. And LNG has become the import source and way of choice, because it has the flexibility and it allows us to diversify compared to the previous pipeline dependencies. So while the demand is going to be reducing over the coming years and towards 2050, it will remain an important part of our energy source. In that context, we hope to continue the transatlantic partnership and the transatlantic trade in LNG. We've invested in import facilities, LNG terminals. We've invested in the domestic infrastructure that is necessary for the change of natural gas flows within the European Union. Essentially, to put it very, very simply, it used to be flowing from east to west because a lot of it was Russian pipeline gas, and now it's flowing from LNG terminals in Greece or Croatia or Italy, for example, going north and going south from the North Sea region or east from the western part of Europe. And so we have now adapted to that new reality, that new composition of our gas supply. And in that context, the transatlantic relation and the US supplies is by far the biggest. So that should continue.
Thank you. Was there another question in the room?
Thank you very much for being here today. I'm Bob Eichert from the Atlantic Council. I was interested in your thoughts about progress with regards to the Western Balkans, because obviously that's a place where Russian gas is still coming in, and with the Turk Stream, and while certainly the Transadriatic has been critical in terms of diversification strategy, even though the volumes are not huge, I'm still concerned about that region, in particular the dependence of Turkey, a NATO ally, on oil, gas, and coal from Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, I think it's a very good point. So the overall dependence on Russia, the imports from Russia, has gone down very, very significantly. 45% of our natural gas before the Russian war in Ukraine, and it's now down below 15%. So at European level, very, very limited amounts, not of concern. But of course, there are some countries in the European Union and in the neighborhood that still have a higher level of dependence nationally or even in parts of the country. So what we're doing there is working closely with those governments, either within the European Union, we work in our regional groups, or with the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova, we work together with the Energy Community Secretariat, which is our vehicle for cooperation in the region, to continue to take efforts to reduce the dependence, and that requires some infrastructure, but not big infrastructure investments. It's really more about the interconnectors or the agreements for trade flows across borders that can help make that happen. We have also, maybe I should add to that, an important aspect in our recently agreed legislation on the decarbonization of gas and hydrogen markets in the European Union. We've also taken measures to facilitate the choice for member states of not allowing Russian LNG into their pipeline system. So we keep building the toolbox that we have for adapting our energy system to this new reality, which is a combination of the green transition, higher shares of renewables, higher shares of energy, or better investments into energy efficiency in Europe and globally, by the way, because that was part of the important outcome of COP28, the tripling of renewables, doubling of energy efficiency, and again, a security agenda as well as a climate agenda. And then at the same time, making sure that the molecules we still have in the system are as clean as possible, either because they're green hydrogen or biomethane, or because they are at least with the best possible limitation of methane emissions when we talk about fossil energy, and that they're diversified and secure, also in a longer term strategic context.
You know, another aspect of that new reality is that both the report being released today and some other analyses I've seen from IEA and others show that even though Russia is sort of redirecting its flows of both oil and natural gas, finding higher uptake on oil, for example, in China and India, most of what I have seen suggests that Russia will never regain its stature in the global export markets, and that is generally going to be a downward trend. Does that in and of itself create any types of new security fears for Europe? That is to say, as Russia's energy might declines, does it in some level become a more dangerous nation?
I think, first of all, we need to recognize the grandeur and the impact of what has happened over these last few years and the changes in the energy markets, thanks again to steps taken at government level, but also the industry stepping up and making some quick decisions to make sure that market, that the global LNG market, the global gas markets function in the new reality. So a very, very significant turnaround resulting from that. Secondly, as you said, the share of Russian fossil energy in global markets has decreased very, very significantly. Natural gas, most notably, because it was pipeline gas. So if it's not sent via those pipelines, it has really nowhere to go. So it is a very, very significant development. That is a good thing. That is aligned with our Repower EU strategy to reduce and cut dependence on these Russian fossil fuels over the coming years. We've done it even faster than we had dared hope for, plan for. So that, I think, is evidence of the level of engagement and commitment to that. So that brings me to your specific question. I think the security concerns are primarily a concern for Ukraine that has been invaded by Russia, that is under constant attack by Russia. That is where our focus is, on helping Ukraine stay as secure as possible, close cooperation with Ukraine, continued support for Ukraine. The European Union is the biggest supporter, has since the beginning of the war been the biggest supporter of Ukraine, 88 billion euro so far, and with a new Ukraine facility of an additional 50 billion euro. So that's really where our focus is.
Thank you. I think bringing it back to Ukraine is a terrific point to end on. Director General, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And now we're going to move into the next phase of the program. I'd like to introduce our next speakers and panelists for a discussion that I will be moderating. We have Ambassador Richard Morningstar, the former U.S. ambassador to the EU and the founding chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, who we heard from earlier. We have Ambassador Andras Simonyi, who is a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and Hungary's former ambassador to the U.S. And we have in person Olga Kakova, the deputy director for European energy security with the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and a well-respected analyst and expert. So thank you for joining us both virtually and next to me. So yeah, let's jump right in with some of the things that we just heard. Ambassador Morningstar, I wanted to start with you and ask a little bit more about this major report that was launched today. I know you've put a lot of work into it. What were some of your top takeaways from the findings of that report, and which of the major principles do you think should hold true under any possible outcome of this horrible conflict?
Right. Thank you, Ben. And first of all, thank you for just really a wonderful discussion with Ditte Juul Jørgensen. It was terrific, and I think we'll be emphasizing a lot of things that she said. First of all, with respect to the report, I do want to remind people that we've already published 3 issue briefs in connection with this project, all of which have been referenced in the final report. So I think you should look at it as a total package. My reactions to the final report, it's interesting. I think it's a terrific report, and I, again, thank my co-authors who deserve much or most of the credit. And we did modeling under 5 different scenarios as to what would happen with respect to Russian imports, all the way from the Ukrainian victory to continued fighting, to a frozen conflict, to a negotiated settlement, and to a Russian victory, which obviously we hope will never happen. And we did modeling under each approach. One of the things that I found most interesting is that you can make different arguments as to what the result would be under each different scenario. And it's something that we could debate, forever as to what would actually happen under each scenario. Because there's more than one potential answer, I think, in each case. But to me, and this gets really to your question, is what is key under each scenario is never again. Never again, under any circumstance, should there be a dependency in Europe on Russian energy, no matter what the scenario. And that Europe has to resist any temptation, depending on what the future is, to go back to some kind of dependency. Yeah, maybe there'll be, Russia will be able, under some circumstances, to compete in a competitive market, but never again dependency. A related point, and I think that Ditte made reference to this: don't trade a dependency on Russia for a dependency on China, for example, on critical materials, or any other country. I actually heard when Andras Landon and I were in Europe, in Brussels, a couple of weeks ago, there were even some people concerned about a dependency on the U.S. for LNG. I'm not terribly concerned about that, but don't trade dependencies. A third point that comes from this, I have a total of 4. The third is that, and I've said this before, long before we did this report, that fossil fuels, particularly gas, and the energy transition, it's not an either-or proposition. Ditte made clear, gas in Europe is going to continue to be necessary for European energy security, really for the foreseeable future, to be able to supply affordable energy to all of Europe. Yeah, it needs to be as clean as possible. And the US and the EU and the private sector need to work closely together to make sure that happens. But it's also important to remember that the green transition relates not only to climate change, but it also relates to energy security, because the greater new technologies take effect and are introduced, that's going to reduce any possible dependency on any one supplier and all of the different scenarios. And we also have to remember that without energy security, that's going to be a danger to the green transition. Because if people are concerned about the green transition being too expensive or not enough energy being supplied, there's going to be pushback. So that it is critically important that there be some degree of balance, but as we continue to push on to produce gas, we also have to push as hard as possible to get the green transition accomplished. And then the final point, and Ditte said it all, and I'll just reinforce it. Transatlantic cooperation is absolutely critical. We can't do this alone. We have to do it together. We need to cooperate on liquefied natural gas. We need to cooperate on making gas cleaner. We need to cooperate on the green transition. We have to cooperate on new technologies, whether it be new forms of nuclear energy, hydrogen, in the future fusion, any number of things. We have to take an all of the above approach and work together. And we need to work together again on critical materials. I think Ditte was somewhat diplomatic in her comments on our cooperation on that. We do need to have a free trade agreement on critical materials. And because of age-old issues between the US and the EU on trade, it hasn't happened yet. We have to work together, both on agreements such as on free trade, but also on opening up new sources And then finally, we need to cooperate on Ukraine reconstruction. And I know that Olga will speak more on that.
Thank you. That feeds into something I wanted to ask Ambassador Shimonian. How would you describe the current state of the transatlantic relationship? And what do you see as the potential changes we could see if there's a change in administration in the US, if Donald Trump wins? And how could this relationship change depending on the outcome of the elections we're going to see, I believe, this summer in the European, for the European Parliament?
Ben, thank you very much. And I want to join Ambassador Morningstar in thanking our colleagues who have worked on this report. It's a great report, and I hope you will all read it. I want to ask you: is the Director General still in the room?
In spirit.
Yeah.
She is.
No, she's not.
Oh, she's not, because I just wanted to make to begin with. I wanted to make a comment and a general comment. You know, no one would have thought that Europe would survive the sharp decline in Russian gas imports, and Europe's efforts and results were more than impressive. And I also want to say that the EU's decisions delivered a powerful message that if there's a political will and clear leadership, Europe is able to act firmly, decisively, and fast. I repeat, firmly, decisively, and fast. And I think that is a message which has an impact way beyond just energy and energy security, boosting the EU's standing and reputation in the United States. So I just wanted to, although she's gone, but I just wanted to thank the Director General for her leadership and the other colleagues in Europe who have really stepped up to the plate. Now, before I respond to your question, allow me just to make two major comments. The one comment is that the circumstances since we started working on the study have changed. I think we were a lot more hopeful at the outset that by 2024 we will have left the war behind us. And although we still believe Ukraine must and will win this war, dark clouds are gathering, and victory seems more and more difficult, and there's an unfortunate fatigue in the public and the political elites that is keeping us awake at night. It worries us that some want to see a quick end to the war, even if it means giving in to Russia, and as a consequence, see cheap Russian gas flowing to Europe again as a possibility, as a solution to some of the competitiveness issues that Europe has. And I say this because I want to dovetail with what Ambassador Morningstar said. Dick was very, very clear. Never again should Europe be dependent primarily on Russian gas. And I would also make yet another comment that I think the study makes it very clear that there is the choice between green transition and energy security is a dangerous false choice. Our position is clearly more energy security, not less green transition. Now, I'll come to your response. So first of all, I belong to those who disagreed with the administration's recent decisions to pause the permits. I think the Europeans were caught by surprise. I think the Director General was very, very polite and diplomatic, but I do feel that the Europeans were kind of caught aback by these decisions. And while the message from the United States that it's suspension, it's temporary, I think the Europeans are kind of worried, and I think the Europeans need security, need some guarantees that the United States will be able to supply gas in the quantities that the Europeans need. And as far as we are concerned, I cannot answer the question what kind of policies there would be if a different administration is elected. But even if there is a continuation of this administration, we need to be very, very clear that the United States will work with the Europeans, one, on cleaning up the production of gas. Two, that there will be plenty of gas, enough gas to supply to Europe. The Europeans, and it's kind of interesting. Yes, when we were in.
Oh, I don't think he realizes that we can't hear him.
Anything we can do?
My lip reading skills are below average, so I would try to translate. So while they're adjusting that, why don't we move on to something I wanted to ask you, Olga, and let's give, which I think. What do you think?
Yeah.
Should I?
Sure, let's do that.
Yeah.
Maybe we can send Ambassador a note saying we can get back to him.
Oh, should I
as soon
just
as we can.
write down that he's muted and show it to him?
It's fine.
Okay.
Our team will do that.
All
Yes,
right.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I wanted to get to, this actually dovetails with something that he was saying, which is that, we've heard both these gentlemen say never again with respect to Europe's reliance on Russia. But, the future is hard to predict in a lot of different ways. Needless to say, that's not the hottest take in the world. So how would you assess the current risk of Europe returning to that reliance on Russia, given the potential outcomes of the war and so forth?
No, I think that's a really great blanket statement as we try to look at the different scenarios. We're not trying to predict the future here as we're looking at the possibilities. I think this is just a solid conversation starter to make sure that we are being proactive and trying to anticipate through the lens of the transatlantic relationship on what can be done instead of being responsive, right? So in this case, to answer your question, a couple of different variables will impact. The answer is, the future of Russia, the future of just broadly of gas in European energy mix. And we know that every scenario that you look at, there are some that are more conservative in terms of the amount of gas that will be needed. If all of the climate plans are met, all of the targets are met, and there are some that are, I don't want to say realistic, but are perhaps more towards less target-focused scenarios, and they actually range 180 BCM by 2040. So that's the difference between some of the best, smartest, people out there assessing what the demand will be like in the next in a decade and a half, to figure out how we can prepare for that best. So first of all, just recognizing the uncertainty, but we do know for sure gas will continue playing an important role, even if there is a disagreement across the research community on exactly what that number 100% will look like, right? So we know the demand is going for broadly for gas will be there. The next question is, will Russia have the gas to provide? And the third question is the political will and then the market forces around it. Now, politically, I don't see any signs that Europe, you will have politicians going out there and saying, advocating for let's bring back, Russian gas. In all of this scenario, even in the best case, I mean, I think in the case of Ukrainian victory, I think we can see perhaps some voices saying, well, let's give Russia another chance. And we are addressing that in our report, saying we really need to be careful here. But broadly, even in the near future, there's really no political appetite to see any significant increase in Russia. However, there are the market forces, right? And even though Europe has held unified over the last 2 years and has spent a lot of money to make sure to diversify away from Russian gas, there are some market forces, some voices that could perhaps pull towards having some increases through some pipelines. I think countries that are closer through to the front lines, you'll see greater pushback there, and you'll see the political leadership pushing stronger back there. However, political leadership needs some kind of legislative regulatory bans to back it up. So right now, Europe does not have a ban on piped gas or LNG. However, EU made some progress on enabling nations to individually to be able to say, we would like to ban Russian gas, pipe gas or LNG or whatever that may be. In the past, that was not possible because of the competitive market rules that EU has created. So looking through all of this through this lens, the possibilities there, I think it's less likely for the countries closer to the front lines. But we must be proactive. Again, I don't think we can take anything for credit. And looking into the future and creating a proactive policy and figuring out what percentage is reliance too big. So we've seen what 43% does, and we've seen the shock and how much that costs for the households, for the businesses, for competitiveness of Europe. So what is, for those who might say, okay, well, maybe if Ukraine does win, what is that right percentage? I think that conversation needs to start now. And perhaps there could, there might be an agreement that it's actually really low, or it's actually like 10, 15. I'm just throwing numbers out there. But that conversation needs to be had now versus kind of waiting for this to happen on its own. And also creating transparencies around the gas that will be moving to Europe, for example, through Turkey, through Azerbaijan, to make sure that Europe is keeping track of where the gas, even if you were to ban Russian gas, Russian pipe gas, LNG, that the gas that's coming through, there's some clarity, because right now the transparency is more opaque, if you would. And on LNG, if you were supposed to ban LNG and that was the only action taken, that's not sufficient when it comes to impacting Russia's LNG on the market and how much Russia is able to make off of those sales, because it's extremely liquid. It's not as liquid as oil markets. Europe paid about 10 billion for Russian LNG last year. So it's really about going after the source. It's really going after the actual projects, the developed projects like the Arctic 2 that we've seen U.S. sanction, and we've seen the implications of such. Definitely.
Those are all great points. I want to put a pin in one of them for a second and return to it, but I believe right now we have Ambassador Shimoni back with us. Ambassador, we sadly got cut off with you for a moment, but you were getting to what the repercussions of the change in administration could be and what the future needs to hold vis-a-vis the sort of never again concept on such high levels of reliance.
Yeah, I want to remind you that the previous administration had a very strong and pretty close cooperation with the European Commission, and famously, the then Energy Commissioner Maros Šefčovič participated in the opening of one of the major plants in the United States, together with the then president. And I just want to, personally, I have no doubts that the energy cooperation will survive. And I want to repeat what I said in the end. I don't know if this was caught in the conversation, but I want to repeat what I said in the end, that the Europeans really need guarantees. Even if there is no change in the administration, they need long-term guarantees. They want to know that they can count on the United States to supply LNG. By the way, one of the very, very important comments the Director General made, and this is something that we have been discussing, is the danger of the Russians supplying LNG to Europe. The Russian LNG to Europe is a temptation, but it is also dangerous. Mm-hmm. So replacing pipeline gas from Russia with LNG from Russia is not a great idea. And the way to do it is to make sure the United States gives guarantees to the Europeans that we will work, one, to make sure that we can supply LNG long term. Two, the United States need to signal to the Europeans that we're ready to continue to work with the Europeans in order to make our production as clean as possible. And I think that's an ongoing conversation, but that's something that we will be looking for, whether there is a change of administration or not.
Thank you. And that actually, those dangers of reliance on one resource, I think, can potentially sort of start to crop up in other types of resources as well. So Ambassador Morningstar, I wanted to bring it back to you. How would you assess the level of U.S., EU, and U.S. European cooperation on sort of clean energy inputs and critical minerals? And has there been sufficient efforts to make sure that there's not a trading of reliance on Russia to a trading of over-reliance on China, from everything from solar panels to battery minerals and several other kind of clean and low-carbon inputs?
Yeah, I will certainly answer that, give you my answer to that question, Ben. I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things very briefly that Andras was saying. One, Russian LNG. We have to be I agree, we have to be very careful about that, There's been an increase in Russian LNG to Europe. They're not big amounts at this point, but they could become big amounts, and we have to be very careful on that. The other thing that hasn't come up is nuclear fuel. One of the things that is really, I was actually really surprised. I didn't realize it was this much. Imports into Europe of Russian nuclear fuel have doubled since the beginning of the Ukraine war. And, I say, well, we're dependent on it. Well, we need to find other sources and so forth. I think that's also a dangerous thing. And then one quick comment on Trump. There may be, if in a Trump administration, there will be hugely serious issues with Europe in all different spheres. But one of them I don't think will be supply of LNG. I think that politically, Trump, he wants to produce as much LNG as possible, export as much as possible. I think that would continue. On your question that you actually asked me on critical materials, I don't know how I would give it a grade. It's been okay, but not great. There's been a lot of discussion, as Ditte Juul Jørgensen said, a lot of discussion as to where materials can be found, how to avoid the dependency. But to me, it was very discouraging that, and we heard this in Brussels, that the attempts to finally conclude a free trade agreement on critical materials didn't come through. And it related to issues, long existing issues on US tariffs on steel and aluminum, sort of pushing the EU to raise tariffs on China while we maintained our tariffs on the EU. We've got to get through all these issues once and for all. They're the same types of issues going back 25 years ago when I was ambassador to the EU. The other thing that we heard, and it's very disturbing, you mentioned, I think in your question, you mentioned electric vehicles. Are we too late? The concern that we've heard in Brussels, I think there's increasing concern in the United States, is that maybe we are too late on solar panels, on electric vehicles. I mean, what we heard several people say, and I've heard it now in the US, that, hey, Chinese electric vehicles, not only are they cheaper, but they're better. I've literally had some people tell me that they're better than a Tesla. These are things, and clearly on solar panels, the same thing. That the only way I think we're going to maybe catch up and go ahead of China as a single supplier in these areas, it's not just subsidies, it's coming up somehow with better technologies. And that's what we really need to work with our European friends on our technology advances. And that's going to relate also back to this whole question of free trade in critical materials, and what we should be doing to ensure that. So, yeah, I would say that the cooperation has been fair at best, and there's a lot of work to be done, and that it's critically important.
Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought. So I'd like to see if we have anybody in our audience who would like to ask a question on some of the topics that we've been discussing here. I think I see a hand here. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for a great discussion. Rachel Ziemba, Center for New American Security. You've talked, Ambassador Morningstar, just now about the need for more collaboration and cooperation on critical materials. I'm wondering, one of the challenges right now is not only this trade issue, but how to adjust to the fact that, in a sense, because of Chinese dominance and in a sense, oversupply, something we've maybe seen in other sectors as well, that prices have fallen. There's a lot of ideas and question marks there about what's the right market response, government response. Are there any thoughts you have or the rest of the panel has on whether should be some sort of joint transatlantic or G10 or MSP kind of agreement on sort of setting some type of long-term price signal? There's some ideas out there, but I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Olga, is that something?
No, thank you so much for your question. I think it dives into kind of the next issue that both the transatlantic allies are paying attention to right now. We're really focused on energy security. Now it's energy security, competitiveness, and supply chains. So absolutely kind of looking into how do we actually work in this area together and not see this as a zero-sum game. What mechanisms exist, that have been successful, that have worked well, what has been achieved. And ask ourselves, can we do more with the existing, like for example, the council meeting that's happening tomorrow, figuring out what can be done there. And we've had some really great examples, some successes, but also, as was mentioned by Ambassador Morningstar and Ambassador Shimoni, some of those conversations have stalled and we haven't seen as much progress. So figuring out, do we need new mechanisms or how do we re-enhance, reinvigorate what's already happening? I think making sure that we prepare our economies together for a more digital, AI potentially driven, more interconnected, an economy that responds to consumers who are curious about where their supply chains are coming from, who are curious about the carbon intensity of their supply chains and want to participate in those decisions today. So how do we work together on those issues? But please, I want to make sure others have a chance to respond as well.
Ambassador Shimoni.
Yeah, I just want to add something Ambassador Morningstar said. Well, our impression is that once again we're falling into the trap of stalling or preventing an agreement, like we prevented the TTIP agreement because of chlorinated chicken. And I don't want to simplify it because it's a very complicated negotiation. It's a very complicated, but at the end of the day, I think agreement and figuring out how we deal with this is far more important than the details that are basically getting in the way of this. So this is the first thing, and this needs a lot of political efforts on both sides. I repeat, and then I'd also like to add that nobody has talked about the issue of security premium. I think there is a premium to security which we have not been ready to pay in the past. And this is something we will have to live with. And as we must vector it into whatever we do so that we don't abandon the idea of security or the priority that is security just because we think it is, let's go the easier way. Our worry after our conversations in Europe is that there are some circles in Europe who say, hey, but wait a minute, we need to work with the Chinese because that will make us more competitive. But it will be exactly what Ambassador Morningstar said, replacing one dependency with another dependency, and that's a dangerous path to go down.
Thank you.
Maybe,
and as we start to run short on time, I'd like to turn it back to you, Ambassador Morningstar, to answer this one.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say I wanted to send this question your way as well that we just heard from the audience.
Oh, okay. I think that Olga and Andras have really answered it well. The one thing that has not been addressed, and I'm not totally sure what the questioner meant, that talked about price signals and what she means by price signals. One possibility is the U.S. and Europe, the EU, agreeing on tariffs. I have sort of mixed feelings on that. Part of me says, well, at least on a temporary basis, maybe that makes sense. I'm not a real economist, so I'd want to think through, and we would have to all think through what the ramifications of that would be. But it's not just a price issue, it's a quality issue as well. And that's what I picked up on our last trip, which I'd thought about before, but never as blatantly as we heard. The Chinese product is better than our products right now, is what they're saying anyway. And we have to address that issue as well as any temporary measures.
Thank you. Well, it's been an amazing, brutal and tragic in a lot of ways, but amazing discussion and an amazing couple years in terms of Europe's energy posture. We're starting to run over time. There's so much to discuss. I would like to turn things back right before the reception that's going to be outside to Landon Durrence, the Senior Director, and Richard Morningstar, Chair for Global Energy Security with the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. It's great to be here. And as Ben mentioned, I'm Landon Durrence. I'm the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center. And thanks to Dick, also the Morningstar Chair for Global Energy Security. Needless to say, we're incredibly proud and frankly excited about this report. Unequivocally, the contours of transatlantic energy security have been, I think, transformed permanently in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this report, despite exploring multiple avenues, multiple angles for what an outcome could look like, I think sends one really clear message that reinforces a strong Europe, a strong Ukraine, really begins with a future that sustains a less Russian energy and influence in that system. And we support that, and we think that that also will propel a strong transatlantic alliance and partnership. As today's event comes to a close, I do have some thank yous. First and foremost, very thankful to our partnership and collaboration with DG Energy. Thank you to Director General Jørgensen for kind of giving us a deep dive on the state of affairs in the transatlantic partnership, covering energy security, natural gas, Ukraine, and many, many more facets as the transatlantic partnership weaves its future together on shared security, competitiveness, and sustainability goals. I would like to also congratulate and thank our panelists / report authors, Ambassador Morningstar, Ambassador Shimoni, Olga Kakova, and thank you, Ben, as our moderator, Ben G-Men from Axios, for contributing to a very vibrant conversation today. I think we're thrilled with the importance of highlighting this transatlantic partnership, how it can be impacted and build towards future cooperation, no matter what the political outlook looks in the future. Finally, I have a strong obligation and desire to thank the Smith-Richardson Foundation. This project does not exist without the Smith-Richardson Foundation. It's created the space at the Global Energy Center for us to cover very meaningfully the facets of the transatlantic cooperation, of transatlantic energy and climate security, for us to look in support of Ukraine and the reconstruction that we hope to be a continued part of as we build forward. We wouldn't have this opportunity without the Smith-Richardson Foundation. This report wouldn't exist without the Smith-Richardson Foundation, so we're very, very thankful for that. And then finally, these events, as you all know, that have attended before, they don't happen without a lot of talented support from the team behind the scenes. So let me say, for those at the Atlantic Council that helped pull this event together, Olga, of course, but also Maya Sparkman, Lisi Bowen, and Tativik Kach-Trian. We really appreciate the work that went into making this happen. We'll now break for a reception. As a reminder, this for those in the audience, for those watching virtually, these products remain on ACTV and our YouTube platforms. So share this product, share this conversation, and future ones. Thank you for making the time today, and look forward to hosting you for many, many more opportunities in the future. Thank you.